She packed her life into a single battered leather valise and walked out the servant's door before dawn. No tearful goodbyes, no lingering glances at the grand estate where she had been nothing but an unpaid servant in a silk dress. Beatrice Hallam stepped into the unforgiving London fog, believing she had escaped with absolutely nothing to her name. What she didn't know was that Arthur Cavendish, the Duke of Redbourne, had already drafted the marriage settlements. He was just waiting to spring the trap. It was 2:30 in the morning when Beatrice finally accepted that her life was entirely meaningless. The realization did not come with a dramatic crescendo of music or a sudden weeping fit. It came quietly in the suffocating heat of the Danbury ballroom while she was kneeling on the floor, pinning up the torn hem of her cousin's gown. "Careful with the needle, Beatrice," Clara snapped, her voice a reedy whine that managed to cut through the din of 100 waltzing couples. "That is French lace. You can't just hack at it." Beatrice didn't look up. Her knees ached against the polished floorboards, her fingers, calloused from years of mending, copying letters and managing the household ledgers her aunt was too lazy to read, moved with mechanical efficiency. She drove the pin through the heavy silk, narrowly missing her own thumb. "It is fixed, Clara. Try not to let Lord Davenport step on it again." She stood, brushing the dust from her own skirts. Her dress was an offensively dull shade of slate gray. It was 5 years old, remade twice, and designed specifically to make her invisible. It worked perfectly. As Clara fluttered back onto the dance floor, laughing at a joke made by some forgettable viscount, Beatrice retreated to the alcove behind the potted ferns. She was the poor relation, the orphaned niece. She was furniture that occasionally breathed. From across the room, Arthur Cavendish watched her retreat. The Duke of Redbourne was not a man given to whims. He was 32, brutally wealthy, and possessed a reputation so deeply rooted in cold, calculating ruthlessness that most debutantes approached him with the terrified reverence usually reserved for wild animals. He hated the season. He despised the desperate, sweating ambition of the ballrooms. Yet, for the past 4 weeks, he had attended every major event. He was watching the shadows. He was watching her. Arthur took a slow sip of his scotch, the crystal glass heavy in his hand. He noted the sharp line of Beatrice's jaw, the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes, and the rigid, exhausted line of her spine. She wasn't beautiful in the way society demanded. She was too sharp, too pale, too guarded. But while the rest of the women in the room performed like trained show ponies, Beatrice Hallam endured. He had first noticed her a month ago, arguing with a fishmonger in the rain while holding an umbrella over her complaining aunt. She had bartered the man down with a ruthless, dead-eyed pragmatism that Arthur found instantly, inexplicably fascinating. Since then, he had watched her. He had seen her patch family scandals, manage drunken uncles, and absorb 1,000 petty cruelties without shedding a single tear. "She's wasting away here," Arthur thought, his jaw tightening. "They are draining her to the bone." He set his glass down on a passing tray. It was time. He had gathered enough information. He knew her family's debts, he knew their precarious social standing, and he knew exactly how much pressure to apply. He would call on her uncle tomorrow morning. He would make an offer they could not refuse, and by the end of the week, Beatrice would be removed from this parasitic family and installed in his own home as his duchess. He didn't ask himself if she would want him. Arthur dealt in realities. He was a duke. She was a penniless companion. It was a transaction she would be foolish to reject, and from what he had observed, Beatrice was never foolish. He took a step forward, intending to cross the room and demand a dance, a final formal declaration of his intent to the watching crowd. But a sudden commotion near the terrace doors caught his attention. Beatrice's aunt, Lady Arbuthnot, was standing over the girl, her face flushed with gin and fury. "You lost it!" Lady Arbuthnot hissed, her voice carrying over the string quartet. "A diamond clasp, Beatrice! Do you know what that cost?" "I did not lose it, Aunt," Beatrice replied. Her voice was terribly calm, entirely devoid of inflection. "You gave it to Clara to hold, and Clara left it in the carriage." "Do not lie to me! You resent Clara! You resent us all! After we took you in, clothed you, fed you!" The music seemed to dip. Heads turned. The ugly, raw sound of domestic abuse was spilling onto the pristine ballroom floor. Arthur's chest went cold. He began to walk toward them, his stride lengthening, his anger shifting from a simmer to a hard, freezing certainty. He would ruin the Arbuthnot's. He would strip them of every copper they owned. Before he could reach them, Beatrice did something that stopped him in his tracks. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply looked at her aunt with a gaze so entirely empty, so completely devoid of care, that it looked like a corpse staring at a wall. "You are right, Aunt," Beatrice said softly. "You have clothed me and fed me. I consider the debt paid with my labor. I will not be returning in the carriage with you." "What? Don't be absurd, girl. Get back in the corner." "Goodbye, Aunt." Beatrice turned. She didn't run. She walked with agonizing slowness toward the servants' corridor. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Arthur, who was standing a mere 10 feet away. She pushed through the heavy baize door and vanished. Arthur stared at the door. For the first time in his adult life, a flicker of genuine panic flared in his chest. Wait, that wasn't the plan. By the time he shoved his way through the crowd and pushed open the servants' door, the narrow hallway was empty. Only the faint scent of rain and cheap lavender soap remained in the damp air. She was gone. It rained for 3 days after she disappeared. The London streets turned into a slick, filthy mirror of soot and horse dung. Beatrice sat on the edge of a narrow, lumpy mattress in a room that smelled of damp wool and boiled cabbage. The boarding house in Cheapside charged 4 pence a night. She had precisely 3 shillings and 2 pence left in her velvet coin purse. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping a thin woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her teeth chattered, a rhythmic, annoying sound in the quiet room. She was hungry. A deep, gnawing cramp sat just beneath her ribs, a stark reminder that pride was an expensive luxury. I have nothing, she thought. The realization wasn't terrifying. It was liberating. For 10 years, she had carried the weight of the Arbuthnot family's crumbling facade. Now, the weight was gone. She was untethered. She could starve, yes, but she would starve on her own terms. She had spent the last 2 days walking until her boots wore thin, answering advertisements in the morning papers, a governess in Bloomsbury, a lady's maid in Mayfair, a seamstress in Covent Garden. In every house she had been turned away. She had no references. When asked why she had left her previous position, she had refused to answer. The society matrons looked at her plain gray dress, her unsmiling mouth, and her proud chin, and they saw a liability. "Tomorrow," Beatrice whispered to the cracked ceiling. "I will try the mills tomorrow." It was a death sentence for a gentleman's daughter, but Beatrice hadn't considered herself a gentleman's daughter since she was 14. Across the city, in a mahogany-paneled library that smelled of leather and expensive cigars, Arthur Cavendish was methodically tearing a family apart. Lord Arbuthnot sat across from the Duke's massive desk, sweating profusely into his cravat. The man looked like a melting candle. Arthur sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the older man with the detached curiosity of an anatomist holding a scalpel. "I will ask you one final time, Arbuthnot," Arthur said. His voice was a low, resonant purr that made the hairs on the back of the uncle's neck stand up. "Where did your niece go?" "Your Grace, I swear on my life, we do not know. The girl is unstable, ungrateful. She packed a single bag and slipped out of the house like a thief in the night." "Did she take money?" "Not a penny. She left the housekeeping funds on the desk, right down to the last farthing." Madness. Arthur leaned back, steepling his long fingers. Not madness, he thought. Pride. She wanted a clean break. She wanted to owe them absolutely nothing. It was infuriating. It was magnificent. "My solicitors have reviewed your outstanding debts, Lord Arbuthnot," Arthur said softly. "You owe £30,000 to various creditors. Your estate in Sussex is mortgaged twice. You are, for all intents and purposes, ruined." Arbuthnot choked. "Your Grace, surely." "I have bought all of your debt," Arthur interrupted, dropping the papers onto the desk with a heavy thud. Every single note. I own you, Arbuthnot." The uncle went violently pale. "Why?" "Because your niece caught my eye. Because I intended to make her my duchess. And because your wife's grotesque lack of civility chased my future wife into the streets." Arthur leaned forward, planting his hands flat on the desk. The mask of polite society slipped, revealing the predator beneath. "If she comes to harm, if she freezes or starves or is touched by a single drunkard in the gutters of this city, I will not just call in your debts. I will ruin you so thoroughly that your grandchildren will be born in a workhouse. Do we understand each other?" Arbuthnot nodded, violently, unable to speak. "Get out," Arthur whispered. As the door clicked shut behind the trembling man, Arthur's man of business, a sharp-eyed clerk named Mr. Finch, stepped out from the shadows of the alcove. "The Bow Street runners have been dispatched, Your Grace," Finch said quietly. "We are checking boarding houses, pawn shops, and employment agencies. A woman matching her description cannot stay hidden for long." "She is smart, Finch. She won't use her real name." Arthur turned to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The city was a sprawling, devouring beast. The thought of Beatrice out there, cold and alone, twisted a physical knot in his gut. He had waited too long. He had wanted to observe her, to be certain of her character, and his caution had cost him. "Find her," Arthur said to the glass. "Spend whatever it takes. Put a man on every street corner from here to the docks. Find her, Finch." By the 5th day, Beatrice was desperate. She had sold her mother's silver locket, the only thing of value she possessed, for a handful of shillings. She had skipped 3 meals. Her head felt light, stuffed with wool, and the damp cold had settled deep into her bones, making every step a slow, aching effort. She was sitting on a wooden bench in a dingy employment office near St. Paul's, staring blankly at the soot-stained floorboards when her name was called, or rather, the name she had given them. "Miss Hale?" Beatrice blinked, forcing her eyes to focus. A clerk with ink-stained fingers was waving a crisp white envelope at her. "Message just came round for you." She stood, her knees trembling slightly, and took the letter. The paper was thick and expensive. The wax seal was plain, bearing no crest. She broke it open, her eyes scanning the neat, elegant script. To Miss Hale, "It has come to my attention that you are seeking employment as a companion. I am a widow, residing in a quiet home in Highgate. My health is poor, and I require a sensible woman to manage my household correspondence and read to me. The salary is £60 per annum, with room and board provided immediately. If the terms are agreeable, a carriage waits outside to convey you. Yours, Mrs. Edith Sterling." Beatrice stared at the letter. £60 a year was an absurd sum for a companion. It was double what a governess might expect. A loud, cynical alarm bell began to ring in the back of her head. It was too good to be true. It reeked of a trap, perhaps a brothel owner seeking fresh faces, or a desperate scam to lure young women into servitude. But the cold draft from the office window bit through her shawl. Her stomach rolled with sudden hollow pain. She looked at the clerk. "Is the carriage truly outside?" "Aye, miss, a plain black hackney. Driver paid me £1 just to hand you the note." Beatrice folded the letter. If it was a trap, she would fight her way out. She had survived her aunt, she could survive a London trickster, but she could not survive another night in the freezing room in Cheapside. She walked out into the dreary afternoon. A black carriage sat at the curb, the horses blowing steam into the damp air. The driver tipped his hat, but said nothing as he opened the door. Beatrice climbed in, sinking into the plush leather seats. It smelled of saddle soap and something else, a faint lingering scent of expensive tobacco and sandalwood. It smelled familiar, though she couldn't place it. As the carriage jolted forward, heading north toward Highgate, she closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion pull her under. 2 miles away, in the Duke of Redbourne's study, Arthur read the brief note handed to him by his footman. "The package is secured and en route to Highgate." Arthur folded the paper, slipped it into his breast pocket, and let out a long, shuddering breath. For the first time in 5 days, the tight band of panic around his chest loosened. He poured himself a drink, his hand entirely steady. He had not played the hero. He knew Beatrice better than that. If he had ridden into Cheapside in his crested carriage, offering her salvation and a marriage proposal, she would have rejected him out of sheer, stubborn pride. She would have seen it as charity, or worse, pity. She needed to feel she was earning her keep. She needed to feel she was in control. So he had invented Mrs. Sterling. He had purchased a respectable townhouse in Highgate 3 days ago and staffed it with his most trusted, tight-lipped servants. He had paid an elderly retired actress to play the role of the frail widow. Beatrice would have a warm bed tonight. She would eat roast beef and drink thick, hot tea. She would rest, and she would heal from the bruises her wretched family had left on her soul. And then, when she was secure, when the hollow look was gone from her eyes, Arthur would visit his aunt, Mrs. Sterling. He would reintroduce himself. He would court her slowly, methodically, backing her into a corner using nothing but undeniable logic and relentless devotion until she realized that the only logical place for her to be was by his side. He walked over to the mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his dark coat. His reflection showed a man who looked dangerous, driven, and entirely unrepentant. "You walked away with nothing, Beatrice," he thought, a dark, possessive smile touching the corner of his mouth. "But you walked straight into my hands." Beatrice woke to the smell of burning applewood and roasting bacon. For a long, disorienting moment, she simply stared at the ceiling. It was plastered with intricate plasterwork, vines and grapes circling a central rosette. The sheets pulled up to her chin were woven from linen, so exceptionally fine, it felt like cool water against her bare shoulders. There was no damp draft slicing through the window frames. There were no shouts from the street below. She sat up. Her body ached, a deep bruising soreness that came not from injury, but from the sudden absence of tension. Her muscles were finally realizing they no longer had to brace against the cold. She pushed the blankets aside and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. A thick Persian rug absorbed the chill of the floorboards. On the mahogany washstand, a pitcher of hot water sat beside a cake of milled French soap. Beatrice washed, her movements methodical. She did not smile. She did not weep with gratitude. Instead, a cold, hard knot of suspicion began to form in the pit of her stomach. She dressed in her slate gray gown, brushing out the wrinkles as best she could, and stepped out into the hallway. The Highgate house was impossibly quiet. It was not the hollow, echoing quiet of an empty building. It was the insulated, muffled silence of immense wealth. Thick carpets ate her footsteps. The wainscoting was polished to a mirror shine. She found her new employer in the morning room. Mrs. Edith Stanton was a woman of indeterminate age, swathed in expensive cashmere shawls, seated in a velvet wingback chair. She had sharp, bright eyes that didn't quite match the trembling frailty of her hands. "Ah, Miss Hale," Mrs. Stanton said, her voice carrying a theatrical waver. "You look rested. Come, sit, eat." Beatrice took the seat opposite the widow. A silver tray was laden with eggs, ham, toast, and hothouse fruit. "You're very generous, ma'am," Beatrice said carefully. She poured herself a cup of tea. "If I may ask, what exactly will my duties entail? You mentioned correspondence." Yes. Letters to my solicitor, managing the household accounts, reading to me in the afternoons. My eyes are failing, you see." Mrs. Stanton waved a hand vaguely toward the window. "I can begin the accounts immediately after breakfast." "There is no rush, my dear." "I prefer to work," Beatrice stated flatly. "It is what you are paying me an exorbitant sum to do." Mrs. Stanton blinked, momentarily losing the waver in her voice. "As you wish. The ledgers are in the library." Beatrice spent the next 3 weeks trying to find the flaw in the mirage. She tore through the household accounts with the ruthless efficiency of a tax inspector. What she found only deepened her suspicion. The accounts were a fiction. Oh, the math was correct, but the reality they represented was absurd. The butcher's bills were paid in full, in advance, without a single haggled penny. The coal was delivered by the ton, premium grade, yet listed at half the market price. The footman moved with military precision, and the cook prepared meals that rivaled the French chefs of Mayfair. This was not the home of a secluded, ailing widow living on a fixed income. This was a fortress masquerading as a cottage. Furthermore, there was the library. It was a magnificent room, lined with first editions and bound folios. On her 10th day, Beatrice pulled a volume of Locke's philosophy from the highest shelf. As she flipped it open, a scent drifted from the pages, sandalwood and expensive tobacco. It was the exact same scent that had lingered in the hackney cab that brought her here. Beatrice froze, her thumb resting on the rough edge of the paper. She closed her eyes, violently thrusting her memory back to the ballrooms of London. She thought of the men she had observed from the corners, the politicians, the peers, the rakes. A face surfaced from the gloom, hard jaw, dark, unblinking eyes. A man who watched her with the detached, terrifying intensity of a wolf assessing a tethered lamb. The Duke of Redbourne. Beatrice shoved the book back onto the shelf. Her pulse thudded in her ears, a slow, heavy rhythm. She was not rescued. She was captured. The cage was gilded, padded with velvet and stuffed with roast beef, but it was a cage nonetheless. She walked to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens. She could pack her battered leather valise and walk out the front door. But to where? The freezing gutters of Cheapside? The workhouses? No, Beatrice thought, her jaw locking. Let the trap spring. I want to see his face when he realizes I am not a mouse. She did not run. She waited. She drank the rich tea. She ate the hothouse grapes, and she allowed her body to heal. The dark circles under her eyes vanished. Her skin lost its translucent, starved pallor. She built her strength back, ounce by ounce, preparing for war. The inevitable happened on a Tuesday. It rained, a sudden, violent summer downpour that turned the sky the color of bruised iron. Beatrice was in the library, seated at the great oak desk, ostensibly updating the perfectly fictitious household ledgers. The fire was lit. The room was terribly warm. The heavy mahogany doors clicked open. Beatrice did not look up from her inkwell. Mrs. Hughes, I do not need more tea, thank you. I am entirely out of tea, Miss Hallam, but I could offer you an explanation. The voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a physical vibration through the floorboards. It was not a voice used to repeating itself. Beatrice carefully laid her pen down upon the blotting paper. She capped the inkwell. Only then did she raise her head. Arthur Cavendish, the Duke of Redbourne, stood inside the doorway. He was dripping wet. His dark riding coat clung to his broad shoulders, and his boots were smeared with fresh mud. He looked entirely out of place among the pristine, quiet luxury of the room. He looked dangerous. My name, Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute freezing calm, is Miss Hale. Prostit. Your name is Beatrice Hallam, Arthur corrected smoothly, stepping further into the room. He stripped off his leather riding gloves, tossing them onto a side table. You are 22 years old. You are the orphan daughter of a ruined baronet. For a decade, you suffered the profound indignity of serving as a whipping boy for the Arbuthnot family. And for the last 3 weeks, you have been living in a house I purchased, eating food I provided, and auditing ledgers I instructed my clerks to falsify. He waited for the explosion. He braced himself for tears, for outrage, for the slamming of doors. Beatrice merely looked at him. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. The coal prices in the ledger gave you away, she said flatly. Arthur stopped mid-stride. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his aristocratic features. The coal prices? No supplier in London sells premium anthracite for 2 shillings a ton. It was a sloppy detail. Furthermore, your widow forgets her limp when she is anxious, and the carriage that brought me here smelled like your tobacco. Beatrice tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over him with clinical detachment. If you are going to construct a lie, Your Grace, you must respect the intelligence of your captive. It was a terribly executed performance. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then Arthur laughed. It was a rough, unpracticed sound torn from his throat. He walked toward the desk, pulling up a leather wingback chair and sitting directly across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The scent of rain and sandalwood washed over her. Up close, the sheer physical presence of the man was suffocating. "You knew," he said, his eyes gleaming with a strange, dark hunger. "You knew it was a trap, and yet you stayed." "Shafara." "I was starving," Beatrice replied bluntly. "Pride is a luxury for the fed. I calculated that whoever went through the immense trouble and expense of fabricating an entire household merely to ensnare me likely did not intend to murder me in my sleep. So I ate your food and slept in your bed." Arthur's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. "My bed?" "Figuratively speaking." Beatrice kept her face expressionless, though her heart was battering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Why am I here, Your Grace?" "Because you were vanishing," Arthur said. The amusement bled out of his voice, leaving behind a stark, brutal honesty. "I watched you at the Danbury ball. I watched you walk away from the only shelter you had, with nothing but the clothes on your back. It was the most magnificently reckless thing I have ever seen. But I know what London does to women without money or protection. I could not allow it." "You do not own me." "I own the Arbuthnot's," Arthur countered seamlessly. "I bought their debts. They are ruined. They will never touch you again." Beatrice flinched, the first crack in her armor. She hated her aunt, but the sheer casual destruction this man wielded was terrifying. "You destroyed a family simply because I left them? I destroyed them because they mistreated what is mine." "I am not yours," she snapped, her voice finally raising, cracking like a whip in the quiet room. "I am a person, not a ledger entry. You cannot buy my debts and claim ownership of my life." Arthur stood up slowly. He walked around the desk. Beatrice pressed her spine flat against her chair, refusing to shrink away as he loomed over her. He planted a hand on the armrest of her chair, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "I have no interest in owning a pet, Beatrice," he whispered, his voice dark and rough. "If I wanted a compliant, trembling creature, I could have my pick of the debutantes in Mayfair. I want a partner. I want a woman who can negotiate down a fishmonger, audit a forged ledger, and look a duke in the eye and tell him his lies are sloppy." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded, heavy parchment document. He dropped it onto the desk in front of her. "What is this?" she asked, not touching it. "Marriage settlements?" Beatrice stared at the paper. "You are insane." "I am practical. I require a duchess. You require security, a name, and a fortress that the world cannot breach. I am offering you an alliance." "An alliance requires trust," Beatrice said, her voice shaking slightly, though she cursed herself for the weakness. "You lied to me. You cornered me." "I secured you," Arthur corrected gently. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the tense line of her jaw. The touch sent a jolt of static through her skin. "I secured you because if I had offered you this on the streets of Cheapside, your stubborn pride would have made you refuse. You needed to rest. You needed to be strong enough to fight me." He stepped back, putting distance between them, though his eyes never left hers. "Read the settlements, Beatrice. I have given you independent control of an estate in Cornwall. You will have a quarterly allowance that dwarfs the Arbuthnot's entire fortune. If you find my presence intolerable, you may live there, and I will never trouble you. But you will be safe." Beatrice looked down at the parchment. Her hands felt numb. For 10 years, she had been invisible. She had been a convenience, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. Now, this terrifying, powerful man was standing in front of her, offering her the world on a silver platter, bound with chains of iron logic. "And if I say no?" she asked quietly. "Will you throw me back into the street?" Arthur's face hardened. "Never. You can stay in this house for the rest of your life as Mrs. Stanton's companion. I will pay your wages. You will never see me again." He turned and walked toward the door. "I will return on Thursday," he said, pausing with his hand on the brass knob. "If the documents are unsigned, I will respect your decision. But Beatrice?" She looked up. "I've never lost a negotiation." The door clicked shut. The heavy silence of the house rushed back in, but the air felt charged, altered. Beatrice sat alone in the library staring at the marriage settlements. She reached out, her fingers tracing the thick raised wax seal. The Duke was arrogant, ruthless, and manipulative. He had architected a cage to catch her. But as the warmth of the fire washed over her back and the reality of his offer settled in her mind, Beatrice realized the most terrifying truth of all. She was considering saying yes. By Wednesday evening, Beatrice had read the marriage settlements 14 times. The parchment was thick, the ink a dark iron gall black that seemed to mock her with its permanence. It was a masterpiece of legal entrapment, heavily disguised as breathtaking generosity. Arthur Cavendish had offered her financial independence, a sprawling estate in Cornwall, and a title that would make duchesses bow their heads. In exchange, he demanded her absolute legal submission to him as a husband. Beatrice sat by the fire in the Highgate Library, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the wainscoting. She held a pen. The nib hovered over the heavy parchment. She thought of her aunt's sneering face. She thought of the freezing, damp room in Cheapside, the hunger that had hollowed her bones, and the terrifying, vast indifference of London. Then, she thought of Arthur. The dark, unblinking intensity of his stare, the way he had stripped away her aunt's power with a flick of his wrist. He was a predator, but he was asking her to rule the pack with him. Beatrice dipped the pen into the inkwell. She did not sign her name, not yet. First, she turned to the third page. She drew a neat, brutal line through the clause that stipulated the Duke's right to manage the profits of her Cornwall estate. In the margin, in her precise, sloping hand, she wrote, "Profits to remain entirely at the discretion of the Duchess. No interference from the Duke's stewards." She turned the page. She crossed out a paragraph detailing her required residence in London during the season. Residence to be negotiated annually. She added a clause of her own at the bottom of the 5th page. A quarterly budget of £500, entirely separate from household accounts, to be allocated for charitable or personal investments, unaudited. When she was finished, the document was bleeding red ink. Only then did she turn to the final page, smooth the paper flat, and sign Beatrice Hallam with a steady, unhesitating hand. Thursday arrived with a heavy, suffocating fog that pressed against the windows like wet wool. Beatrice did not pace. She sat at the desk, dressed in her impenetrable slate-gray gown, her spine ramrod straight. At exactly noon, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Arthur did not knock. He entered the room carrying the cold air of the street with him. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored coat, his cravat tied with severe precision. He looked less like a man coming to court a woman and more like a general stepping onto a battlefield. He stopped a few feet from the desk. His dark eyes flicked over her face, searching for a sign of retreat. He found none. "Well?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it vibrated with a tension that made the hairs on Beatrice's arms stand up. Beatrice picked up the heavy sheaf of parchment and slid it across the polished oak. Arthur stepped forward. He picked up the document. He did not look at the signature page first. He began to read from the beginning. Beatrice watched his face. She watched his eyes snag on the first line of red ink. She saw his jaw tighten as he read her demand for total financial control over the Cornwall estate. He flipped the page. His eyes scanned her refusal to be bound to London. He read the demand for an unaudited allowance. The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. Arthur lowered the parchment. He looked at her. For a terrifying second, Beatrice thought she had pushed too far. He was a duke. Men like him did not accept terms, they dictated them. She braced herself for the explosion, for the cold dismissal that would send her packing back to the gutters. Instead, the corner of Arthur's mouth twitched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it transformed his face. The hard, calculating mask fractured, revealing a sudden, startling flash of genuine, devastating amusement. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a rich, dark sound that echoed off the leather-bound books. He tossed the mutilated contract back onto the desk. "You crossed out my steward's authority," Arthur said, leaning his hands flat on the desk. bringing his face level with hers. "You demanded 500 pounds a quarter with no oversight. Do you plan to fund a private militia, Beatrice?" "I plan to never have to ask a man for the price of a carriage fare again," she replied flatly. "Do you accept the amendments, Your Grace?" "Accept them?" Arthur's eyes burned with a dark, possessive fire. "I am absolutely thrilled by them. I told you I wanted a partner, Beatrice, not a sycophant." He reached into his coat, produced a silver fountain pen, and signed his initials next to every single one of her red ink amendments. He flipped to the final page, his eyes resting on her signature. The tension drained from his shoulders in one long, heavy exhale. He had her. She was his. "We marry tomorrow," he stated, capping his pen. "Tomorrow?" Beatrice blinked, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "That is impossible. The bans." "I purchased a special license from the Archbishop 3 days ago." Arthur stood straight, adjusting his cuffs. "I'm not giving you time to overthink this, and I'm not giving your uncle time to locate you. I have a carriage arriving at 8 in the morning. Wear whatever you like. I do not care if you marry me in that dreadful gray dress." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "Actually, wear the gray dress," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "It suits your utter disdain for everyone around you. It's entirely magnificent." He left before she could formulate a reply. Beatrice sat alone in the library, her heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the contract, bearing both their names. The snare had snapped shut, but looking at her own red ink scrawled aggressively across the Duke's demands, Beatrice realized she was not the prey. She was a co-conspirator. St. George's, Hanover Square, was vast, cold, and entirely empty. There were no flowers, there was no choir. The great stained glass windows cast long, bruised ribbons of purple and blue light across the dusty stone floor. Beatrice stood before the altar, the scent of old incense and damp stone heavy in her lungs. She had taken Arthur at his word. She wore the slate-gray dress. She carried no bouquet. Arthur stood beside her in stark, terrifying contrast. He wore formal morning dress, his dark hair brushed back, his profile looking as if it had been stamped on a Roman coin. He was a man deeply comfortable with power, radiating an aura of absolute control. Yet, as the vicar mumbled through the liturgy, Arthur's hand, resting lightly beneath her elbow, felt branding hot through her thin sleeve. "I, Arthur Edward Cavendish," he repeated, his voice echoing in the cavernous nave, entirely devoid of the vicar's trembling hesitation. "Take thee, Beatrice, to be my wedded wife." He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He wasn't reciting lines. He was issuing a vow of ownership, a promise of violent protection. "To have and to hold," he continued, the timbre of his voice vibrating in the quiet church. From this day forward, when it was her turn, Beatrice kept her voice perfectly level. She did not tremble. She spoke the words with the crisp efficiency of a ledger entry, though her stomach was tied in knots. She was committing herself to a man who had manipulated her life like pieces on a chessboard. But as he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, a ring entirely devoid of jewels, solid and impossibly heavy, a strange, unbidden sense of security washed over her. It was done. 30 minutes later, the grand crested carriage of the Duke of Redbourne pulled up to the wrought iron gates of Redbourne House in Mayfair. Beatrice stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The house was a fortress of white Portland stone, boasting an imposing portico and windows that stared down at the street like judgmental eyes. It was 10 times the size of the Arbuthnot estate. Inside, the grand entrance hall was lined with 30 servants standing in rigid, terrified silence. At their head stood Mr. Thornton, a butler with the posture of a retired colonel, and Mrs. Higgins, a housekeeper whose pinched face and cold eyes spoke of a woman who ruled her domain with an iron fist. Arthur led Beatrice into the hall. The doors boomed shut behind them, cutting off the noise of the London street. "Staff," Arthur said, his voice carrying effortlessly. May I present Her Grace, the Duchess of Redbourne." A collective synchronized bow and curtsy rippled down the line. Mrs. Higgins rose, her pale eyes sweeping over Beatrice. Beatrice saw the immediate calculation in the older woman's gaze. The housekeeper took in the plain gray dress, the lack of a lady's maid, the absence of jewels. She saw a poor, frightened girl who had somehow tricked a duke into marriage. She saw weakness. "Welcome to Redbourne House, Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins said. Her tone was perfectly polite, yet completely devoid of respect. "I have prepared the blue room for you. I assume you will want to rest. I shall manage the dinner menus as usual." Arthur stood back. He leaned against a marble pillar, crossing his arms over his chest. He did not say a word. He was watching Beatrice. Beatrice looked at the housekeeper. For a decade, she had managed a bankrupt, chaotic household held together by spit, twine, and her own sleepless nights. She had dealt with drunken cooks, thieving footmen, and butchers who refused to extend credit. She knew exactly how a house operated, and she knew exactly how a usurper sounded. Beatrice did not raise her voice. She stepped forward, her flat, deadpan gaze pinning Mrs. Higgins in place. "You will not manage the dinner menus as usual, Mrs. Higgins," Beatrice said softly. "You will bring the menus, along with the weekly household ledgers, the butcher's receipts, and the wine cellar inventory to my sitting room in exactly 1 hour." Mrs. Higgins blinked, taken aback. "Your Grace, surely the ledgers—" "You will also turn over the master set of household keys," Beatrice interrupted smoothly. "I noted dust on the wainscoting in the drawing room as we entered. The footman closest to the door has a frayed collar, and this hall smells faintly of boiled cabbage, which means the kitchen drafts are improperly vented. You have grown complacent." A shocked, suffocating silence descended upon the hall. The butler stared straight ahead, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. "I do not tolerate complacency," Beatrice finished. "1 hour, Mrs. Higgins. Do not be late." Beatrice turned away from the stunned staff. She looked at Arthur. The Duke was still leaning against the marble pillar. His face was perfectly composed, but his eyes were entirely black, blown wide with a raw, visceral fascination. A slow, deeply predatory smile spread across his face. He pushed off the pillar and walked toward her. "Thornton," Arthur murmured as he passed the paralyzed butler. "Show Her Grace to the master suite. The blue room will not be necessary." He stopped beside Beatrice, leaning down so his mouth was a fraction of an inch from her ear. The scent of sandalwood enveloped her. "I bought you a house," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "And you have conquered it in exactly 4 minutes. You are terrifying, Beatrice." "I am pragmatic," she corrected, refusing to lean away, though a shiver traced its way down her spine. "I will not live in a house where the servants think they can manage me." "They will never manage you." Arthur's eyes locked onto hers, heavy with a promise that had absolutely nothing to do with household ledgers. "I am beginning to wonder if I will be able to manage you." "You won't," she said simply. Arthur laughed softly, a low, rumbling sound that settled deep in her stomach. "Good." He stepped back, gesturing toward the grand staircase. "Your empire awaits, Duchess." Beatrice placed her hand on the cold mahogany rail and began to climb. She had walked into the fog with nothing. Now she wore a gold ring that felt heavier than iron, and she walked the halls of a fortress. She did not know if she was a prisoner or a queen, but as she felt the Duke's eyes heavy on her back with every step she took, she knew one thing for certain. She was never going to be invisible again. Within 3 weeks, Redbourne House did not just run. It hummed with the terrifying, lethal precision of a warship. Beatrice did not scream. She did not throw porcelain vases. She merely walked the halls, a silent, watchful phantom in dark plum silk, her ledger tucked under her arm. Her authority was absolute, built on a foundation of unblinking scrutiny. Mrs. Higgins, the once tyrannical housekeeper, now trembled whenever a bell chimed in the study. Beatrice had summoned the woman on her second day and handed her a meticulously drafted list. Vendor audits. All butcher, grocer, and coal merchant accounts to be submitted every Thursday by noon. No exceptions. Wastage. The kitchen's excess allowance was slashed by 40%. Any missing silver would be docked directly from the senior staff's wages. Ventilation. The offending kitchen drafts had been sealed. The boiled cabbage scent was eradicated. The staff quickly learned that the new Duchess possessed the eyesight of a hawk and the mercy of an executioner. But they also learned she was fair. When a scullery maid broke a priceless Ming vase, Beatrice did not fire her. She deducted a single penny from the girl's wages to make a point, then had the vase glued back together to hold fireplace spills. Arthur watched this transformation with an intense, burning fascination. He had expected her to adapt. He had not expected her to conquer. They moved around each other in the massive house like two apex predators sharing a territory, wary, respectful, and endlessly curious. They took their dinners together at the long mahogany table, discussing politics, estate yields, and the fluctuating price of consoles. It was a marriage built on cold, hard intellect. But the outside world was not content to leave them in peace. The news of the Duke of Redbourne's sudden secret marriage to a penniless companion exploded through Mayfair like a gunpowder keg. The gossip sharpened their claws, and inevitably, the ghosts of Beatrice's past came knocking. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Mr. Thornton entered Beatrice's private sitting room. His expression was pinched. "Your Grace," the butler said, staring firmly at the wall just above Beatrice's head, "Lady Arbuthnot and Miss Clara Arbuthnot are in the front hall. They are insisting upon an audience." Beatrice did not look up from the letter she was writing. Her hand did not tremble. The ink flowed smoothly across the page. "Did they bring their calling cards, Thornton?" "They did not, Your Grace. Lady Arbuthnot stated she does not need a card to see her own niece." Beatrice carefully placed her pen in the silver holder. The silence in the room was absolute. For 10 years, the very mention of her aunt's name would have sent a spike of cold panic straight into her marrow. She sat perfectly still, waiting for the familiar terror to arrive. It did not come. Instead, a profound, icy boredom settled over her. "Show them into the blue drawing room, Thornton," Beatrice said calmly. "Serve them the second-best tea. Do not offer biscuits." When Beatrice descended the stairs 15 minutes later, she found her aunt and cousin pacing the length of the Persian rug. The blue drawing room was a masterpiece of intimidation, decorated in heavy silk damask and gilded mirrors that reflected their shabby, desperate anxiety back at them. Lady Arbuthnot turned as the doors opened. She wore a pelisse that was 2 seasons out of fashion, her face heavily powdered to hide the toll of her husband's financial ruin. Clara stood behind her, clutching a reticule, her eyes wide with toxic naked envy as she took in Beatrice's heavy silk gown and the intricate pearl-pin styling of her hair. "Beatrice!" Lady Arbuthnot cried, forcing a horrific stretching smile onto her face. She took a step forward, arms outstretched. "My dearest darling girl, we have been sick with worry. To leave without a word and then to hear you were swept up by the Duke." "Aunt?" Beatrice said. She did not raise her voice. She did not move forward. She stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The single word hit Lady Arbuthnot like a physical blow. The older woman dropped her arms, her fake smile faltering. "Well," Lady Arbuthnot stammered, "I see you have done very well for yourself, though I must say, Arthur's methods were quite brutal. He bought your uncle's debts. He is calling them in. We are to be turned out of the Sussex estate next week, Beatrice. We will have nothing." "An unfortunate consequence of living beyond your means," Beatrice replied, her voice completely devoid of inflection. "You little viper," Clara burst out, her face flushing an ugly mottled red. "You planned this. You threw yourself at him at the Danbury ball, didn't you? You ruined us on purpose." Beatrice looked at her cousin. She remembered kneeling on the floor, pinning the hem of Clara's dress while her knees ached and her fingers bled. She remembered the dismissive sneers, the cold tea left for her in the kitchen, the absolute, grinding humiliation of being invisible. "If I had the power to ruin you, Clara," Beatrice said softly, "I would have done it 5 years ago." Lady Arbuthnot stepped in front of her daughter, her eyes narrowing into desperate slits. "Listen to me, Beatrice. You owe us. We took you in. If it weren't for my charity, you would have died in the gutter. You must speak to the Duke. You must make him forgive the debts. He will listen to you." "I owe you nothing!" Beatrice's voice finally dropped an octave, the temperature in the room plummeting. "I paid for my keep with a decade of unpaid labor. I managed your ledgers, I mended your clothes, and I swallowed your cruelties. The ledger is balanced, Aunt. The debt is settled." "You cannot turn us away," Lady Arbuthnot's voice cracked into a shrill, panic-stricken screech. "We are family." "Thornton," Beatrice said. The butler, who had been standing silently in the hallway, stepped into the frame of the door instantly. "Your Grace? My aunt and cousin were just leaving. Please see them to the door. If they return, you are to instruct the footmen to bar their entry." Lady Arbuthnot gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Clara burst into loud theatrical tears, but Beatrice had already turned her back. She walked out of the room, her spine rigid, her chin high. She didn't look back as Thornton escorted the weeping, shouting women out into the cold London street. When Beatrice reached the top of the stairs, she stopped. Her lungs felt tight. A fine tremor began in her hands. She gripped the mahogany banister, closing her eyes, focusing on the slow, heavy rhythm of her breathing. A shadow fell over her. Arthur materialized from the gloom of the upper gallery. He had been standing there, hidden in the alcove, watching the entire exchange. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't offer hollow comfort. He simply stepped up behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, though he did not touch her. "They asked for mercy," Arthur murmured, his voice a dark rumble against her ear. "Mercy is a luxury for the secure," Beatrice whispered, opening her eyes. "They would have stripped me to the bone if they had the chance." "I know." Arthur raised his hand. His knuckles brushed lightly, almost hesitantly, against the nape of her neck. It was a shockingly tender gesture from a man who dealt in ruin and leverage. "You're a terrifying creature, Beatrice," he said softly. "You built the cage, Your Grace." "No," Arthur corrected, turning her gently to face him. His eyes were entirely unmasked, stripped of their usual cynical armor. "I opened the door. You built the empire." That evening, the great house settled into a heavy, unbroken silence. Beatrice sat in the library, staring into the roaring hearth. The ledger lay open on her lap, but the numbers blurred together. The encounter with her aunt had left a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She had won. She was safe, heavily fortified behind walls of stone and money. Yet, the phantom of the invisible, worthless girl still hovered in the corners of her mind, waiting for the illusion to shatter. The door clicked open. Arthur walked in, carrying 2 crystal glasses and a heavy crystal decanter of scotch. He wore no cravat. His linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, making him look less like a duke and more like the dangerous, ruthless man who had hunted her through the streets of London. He set a glass on the side table next to her chair and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid. "Drink," he ordered softly. Beatrice took the glass. The scotch burned her throat, a sharp, clean fire that chased away the lingering cold in her chest. Arthur sat in the wingback chair opposite her, mirroring the exact position they had taken weeks ago in Highgate, when he had first laid his trap. "You look troubled, Duchess," Arthur observed, his dark eyes locked onto her face. "I am merely calculating," Beatrice lied. "Liar." Arthur took a slow sip of his drink. "You're wondering when the bill comes due. You are waiting for the trap to spring shut, for me to demand the price of all this security." Beatrice's grip on her glass tightened. "Every transaction has a cost. You gave me an estate, a title, and the power to crush my enemies. You signed away your financial control. What do you want from me, Arthur?" It was the first time she'd used his Christian name. The word hung in the air between them, intimate and dangerous. Arthur set his glass down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "When I saw you at the Danbury ball," he began, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register, "I didn't see a victim. I saw a survivor. I saw a woman who looked at the bloated, hypocritical circus of London society with the exact same disgust that I felt." He looked down at his hands, a muscle feathering in his jaw. For a man who controlled everything he touched, he suddenly looked remarkably vulnerable. "I was suffocating, Beatrice," he confessed quietly. "My entire life has been a series of calculated maneuvers. I'm surrounded by sycophants, liars, and people who only see my title. I built this empire, and I realized I was going to die in it alone." He looked up, his gaze piercing through her defenses, dismantling the heavy iron walls she had spent 10 years constructing. "I didn't corner you to own you," Arthur said, his voice raw with a truth he had never spoken aloud. "I cornered you because I recognized you. I saw my own isolation in your eyes. I wanted you to fight me. I wanted you to demand more, to bleed my contracts with red ink, because I needed to know that someone in this God-forsaken world possessed the strength to stand beside me without breaking." Beatrice stared at him. The breath trapped itself in her lungs. "You asked what I want from you," Arthur said. He stood up, crossing the short distance between them. He knelt on the thick rug in front of her chair. It was an act of profound, deliberate surrender from a man who bowed to no one. He reached up, taking the heavy glass from her trembling fingers and setting it aside. Then, he took her hands in his. His palms were warm, calloused from riding, anchoring her to the present. "I don't want your gratitude, Beatrice," he whispered, looking up into her face. "I don't want your submission. I want your trust. I want the only thing you have never given to anyone." Beatrice looked down at the man kneeling before her. The Duke of Redbourne. A predator who had turned himself into a shield for her sake. The cynical voice in her head, the one that had kept her alive through a decade of neglect, screamed at her to pull away. It told her it was a trick. But as she looked into Arthur's dark, unblinking eyes, she saw the absolute, terrifying sincerity there. She let out a long, shuddering breath. The iron around her heart, forged in the freezing gutters of Cheapside and the cruel ballrooms of Mayfair, finally began to melt. She slipped her hands out of his grip, only to reach up and frame his face. Her thumbs traced the hard line of his jaw. "My trust is a heavy burden, Arthur," she warned softly, her voice thick with unshed emotion. "I have broad shoulders," he replied, turning his face to press a fierce, branding kiss into the palm of her hand. Arthur stood, pulling her up with him. He didn't hesitate this time. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Beatrice didn't stiffen. She let her head fall against his shoulder, burying her face in the curve of his neck, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and rain. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his shirt. She had walked away with nothing. She had expected to freeze in the dark. Instead, she had walked blindly into the arms of a man who had built a fire specifically to keep her warm. "I am here," Beatrice whispered into his skin, an admission of surrender, a vow of partnership. "I am not running." Arthur's arms tightened around her like a vice, holding her as if she were the only real thing in his world. "Neither am I, Duchess, neither am I. Survival in a cruel world often demands a heart of iron, but true power lies in knowing when to finally let that iron melt." Beatrice and Arthur didn't build a fairy tale. They built an empire of mutual respect and absolute, terrifying devotion. They proved that sometimes the ultimate act of rebellion isn't walking away with nothing. It's taking everything you are owed. Did you love this ruthless romance? Drop your favorite moment in the comments. Hit like if you want more grounded historical dramas, share with your fellow cynics, and subscribe so you never miss a story.